And you can see some of the numbers here. But there are a few complications, even for discussion of osmosis. For example, remember we're talking about water. Water happens to be a polar solvent. So if you introduce, from your chemistry, what happens when you introduce an ionic compound into a polar solvent? An ionic compound such as sodium chloride into a polar solvent. Yeah, the polar solvent will cause that compound to dissociate into its respective ions. Usually is an anion and a cation. It can be more than one or the other. Right. And remember, according to osmosis, it doesn't matter what the molecular species is, if I introduce a molecule of sodium chloride into water that then dissociates into two ions, I have effectively doubled the osmolality of that solution. So that's what you need to appreciate with respect. You can see here we have again sort of a rectangle, an aquarium or whatever filled with water. Here's our differentially permeable membrane. It's permeable only to the water in this case. And we have a 1 mole glucose solution. Glucose is not polar. Glucose is not going to break down in the water. On the other side, we introduce a 1 mole solution of sodium chloride. Sodium chloride is an ionic compound in the polar solvent. It's going to dissociate into sodium ions and chloride ions. And as a consequence, then it goes from the 1 mole sodium chloride solution to a 2 osmole solution, because we're now talking about total particle concentration. And so in the example up here, 300 millimolar glucose is equivalent to, urea is a little bit funny, but roughly that they behave somewhat similarly, at least with respect to osmosis. But does everyone see how a 300 millimolar glucose solution in terms of osmosis is equivalent to a 150 millimole sodium chloride solution? Because again, that sodium chloride, once you put it in the water, concentration is going to be doubled.
So your little note on the side?
Don't worry about that. That's my effort to be technically correct, but won't be. And it's not something I'm going to ask you about in the test. I try not to give misinformation, and it's absolutely necessary. So that's my effort to avoid that. There was a question earlier about what if you had particles only on one side? And of course, at some point, just simple physics is going to intrude into our discussion of osmosis. And it's kind of illustrated by the YouTube here. This is a different type of YouTube. This is the YouTube from my generation. This is what we meant by YouTube. And so you can see you have a basin trap, a little plumbing trap here. And on one side, you have your differentially permeable membrane there. And across that membrane, you have more particles on the right side than you do on the left side. By osmosis, then water should move in this U-tube from the left to the right, and that's a very important palpable change. You have a change in volume as a consequence of the disequilibrium of the unequal number of particles across that membrane. All right. So again, water flows from the left to the right with respect to the different number of particles. All right. So let's say I don't want that to happen. Let's say I want to prevent the osmotically induced change in the volume of water. As you can see here, you can imagine a little piston there, and now I'm going to push back, all right, so that the volume of water, and I've decided the membrane, it's like reverse osmosis, the volume of water on either side is now equal. All right. The term osmotic pressure, used correctly, used properly, which it virtually never is in textbooks, osmotic pressure describes the force, the amount of force, and it's usually not in newtons, it's usually in just some weight measure, grams or whatever, pounds, is the force necessary to oppose, to prevent the movement of water by osmosis. And again, that's the technically correct definition. I bet you can guess how it's usually used in textbook. What is osmotic pressure? How is osmotic pressure defined? And probably will so in here for the rest of the course. Let's say you're standing right here. Let's go back to the top right one. You're standing right here. There's water rushing. You can't get through the membrane, so you're on the membrane there. And the water is rushing by you. Aren't you going to feel a pressure on your chest, depending on whether you're facing front or back? That's usually how osmotic pressure is defined in the textbooks. So I don't know what to tell you. I know Bob wants a precise definition for this class. And this will be the precise definition for this class. It's the pressure necessary to oppose osmosis. I just wanted to let you know that in the vernacular, it's usually used in this way. It's usually used just to describe the force of the water moving across the membrane. And I don't know what to tell you there, except that's just what you see. But if you understand the word osmotic, it's a force, and it's usually measured again in grams or pounds or whatever. Yes?
Would it be fair to say that if you increase the particle concentration on the right side of the U-tube, that the traditional definition of osmotic pressure would be a higher pressure?
Yeah, exactly right.
Rush has?
Oh, so we indicated, it was a very good question at the break, and we'll try to address it as best we can. But remember, when we talk about osmolality as just a statement of concentration, and we use the terms iso or hypo or hyper, it's usually comparative. And our standard comparison is usually the ECF concentration. Now, in your body right now, you can look around in there if you need to. Is the concentration of particles in your ECF higher or lower than the concentration of particles in your ICF?
Lower.
We've got a raging debate. But I hear dividends more than. I think they should be pretty much the same. Remember, we have a charge disequilibrium across membranes, but overall we should have roughly the same. We should have charge or charge electroneutrality, and for other reasons, the total number of particles should be roughly the same. Now, so if that's true, at least as a starting point, we can assume that the osmolality of the ICF and ECF in a normal person under normal circumstances on a normal, what is today, Thursday, should be approximately the same. So that's why when I say we're usually comparing the IV or the oral hydration therapy to the ECF, that's what I mean. It initially doesn't make any difference. Later on it will. And so, having confused everybody, I do want you to memorize that number up there. You can see several numbers. The physiological osmolality is around 280 to 296. It varies from authority to authority, but those are numbers you should know. You just need to know those from now on. And that's often rounded to 300 for purposes of calculations. So that's good enough for our. But actually, you should know more accurate values as well, because these are just so important. These numbers are going to be so important from now on. All right. So this is the part that everybody loves. Students traditionally love discussions of tonicity. But before we begin talking about tonicity, once again, can somebody define osmolality? What is osmolality? It's just a concentration. It's a number on a bag. It's just an indication of how many particles, total particles, there are in solution, period. And we know that osmosis is just the movement of water across a membrane to differentially permeable membrane with higher total particle concentration. All right. Now, the term tonicity, which is actually much more important for you as a PA, much more important for you as a healthcare worker, has been defined over the years in various ways. But I would encourage you to think of it the following way. Tonicity is not a number. It's not a concentration on a bag. Its phenomenology, its appearance to you, its evidence to you is when water in the body moves from one compartment to another. If at any time water moves from one compartment of the body to another because of a difference in particle concentration, we don't use the word osmolality or osmolarity or whatever to describe that. What do we say? We use tonicity. So we say that the solution introduced, the IV or the hydration therapy, is isotonic, hypertonic, or hypotonic. And what is the determining factor as to whether we use tonicity or osmolality? whether or not there was a change, a shift in the volume of water from one compartment to another. That's the way I would encourage you to approach it. Yes, sir.
So is tonicity always in reference to the solution and not to the cell compartment?
Alex is asking if tonicity is always with respect to the solution rather than the cell. In your line of work, almost always. I can't. But technically, this is a basic science course, and you should be aware that I'm more interested in general principles than in all aspects of clinical practice. So if you're going to test question, I specify that a cell is hypertonic to the solution. You should be able to tell me what happens. But the answer to your question is yes, in all clinical texts, it's the solution that is being described, not the cell, not the tissue. All right. So if that's true, you have a very simple definition of hypertonicity. Basically, if a solution is isotonic, that means that it has the same total particle concentration, and here I'm probably going to change a little bit, same total particle concentration as the intracellular fluid. All right? So it's going to have the same total particle concentration, but again, remember that right now your ECF and your ICF should have the same total particle concentration, so it's a bit of a scholastic distinction. But clinically, I guess the proper thing that I should tell you is that now your focus is upon the ICF. And I could argue that either way. But all right. So if the solution the IV that you introduce to the patient is isotonic, what does that tell us? There is no change. There will be no movement of fluid from the ICF to the ECF or from the ECF to the ICF. That's what an isotonic IV or solution, that's the effect that it will have. However, if I place a cell into a hypotonic solution, what's going to happen to that cell? Will it get bigger or smaller? I put a cell into a hypotonic solution. That's all you need to know.
Shrink.
Remember, water is going to move toward higher total particle concentration.
It's going to come out of the cell.
Hypotonic solution. All right, yeah. A typical example of a hypotonic solution, not typical, but an example of a hypotonic solution would be pure water. I'm going to put a cell, I'm going to take a cell and put it into pure water. Which has the higher total particle concentration, the water or the cell?
Cell.
The cell. Therefore, the water is going to go in which direction?
Come out of it.
Into the cell. Into the cell. Will the cell increase in volume or decrease in volume? So make sure you understand that general principle. If I put the cell into a hypotonic solution, that's all you need to know. You don't need to know any numbers. What's going to happen? All right, the water is going to move from the cell into the surrounding solution, and therefore the cell, if it's a red blood cell, will crenulate or become smaller. Yes, sir.
How does this relate to
Doesn't. That process is entirely different. It has to do with the membrane proteins and how they change in the dermis and the epidermis. It has nothing to do with osmosis, or at least not the fact that they're wrinkling. That's unrelated to osmosis and tonicity. All right, so we understand those terms. And again, there are other definitions you will encounter of tonicity, but I think for our purposes, that's what we're approaching. Yes.
I have a question. Since we're taking into consideration particles and not necessarily the content of water, so if it's hypotonic, that means the solution has less particles in the cell?
Yeah.
And if it's hypertonic, the solution has more particles in the cell?
Exactly. Yeah. And that, unless I tell you otherwise, you can make those assumptions. Yeah.
If you leave a cell in a hypotonic solution for long enough, will it actually burst, or will the tension back in the cell make it evolve?
It depends on the type of cell. If you're talking about eukaryotic animal cells, they usually burst. Bacterial cells may or may not burst. Plant cells actually have what are called cell walls that tend to prevent that. Fungi have that as well. And so this is just an illustration of what we've been talking about. But now we do have, just as we had the ionic compounds to deal with respect to osmosis, there is a little bit of a complexity we need to address. Why don't we go to this slide, and let's see if we can work through this. So what we have here is a cell with 6 particles in it. Here's our cell with 6 particles. And I'm going to put that cell into a solution, a beaker here, that also has 6 particles. Okay? So the number of particles in the cell is equal to the number of particles in the solution. All right? So here we go. The 6-particle cell is now in the 6-particle solution. All right, now let's watch what happens here. As we go from this slide to this slide to this slide, the cell gets bigger. It shouldn't get bigger if the number of particles is equal in both the cell and the solution. What we need to pay attention to understand this is that some of these particles are labeled N, some of them are labeled P. So P means penetrating or permeable. N means non-penetrating or non-permeable. So make sure you understand that. Now we can see that all of the particles in the cell are non-penetrating. And that's a fairly safe biological assumption. Because if particles in your cell had the ability to pass through the membrane, they would have already done so. Right? They would have equalized. What does diffusion tell us? What's the principle of diffusion? Everything equalizes, right? Everything. So if there's a particle, by fixed law, everything would have diffused. So this is a reasonable assumption. But notice that there are half of the particles in the solution into which we're placing the cell are penetrating particles. Unfortunately, they give us an odd number, which complicates things. So these penetrating cells have the ability to diffuse across the cell membrane. So what's the second law of thermodynamics tell us? What's going to happen? Half of those penetrating particles are now going to move into the cell without adding any energy. That's simple diffusion. All right. So what is the consequence? We now have more particles inside the cell than outside the cell. Everybody see why? Because once again, half the particles outside the cell were penetrating. They're simply going to diffuse until equilibrium is achieved and the concentration across the membrane is equal. So if that's true, if we now have more particles inside the cell than outside the cell, water is going to move toward higher total particle concentration, and as a consequence, the volume of the cell increases. All right. All of these two solutions, look at the cell up there, the yellow cell and the blue solution here. All of those are those two containers of fluid. Isoosmotic is the volume hyperosmotic or hypoosmotic? Which is the correct term?
ISO.
For the top left illustration. What is it? Iso. Exactly right. Excellent. It's isoosmotic. But what about the fluid, the solvent into which we place the cell? Is it isotonic, hypertonic, or hypotonic? All right. So it's no longer. We can't use the word isotonic. If it were isotonic, there would be no change in volume. The solution is hypotonic relative to the cell, right? Fluid's going to pass toward higher particle concentration into the cell. Everybody see the distinction? So what does this tell us? We can have an isoosmotic solution that is what? Hypotonic. We can have a hyperosmotic solution that is isotonic. Everybody see why that is? So don't assume that osmolality and tonicity are equivalent. What is the distinction as indicated by this graphic? Right, the fact that some molecules have the ability to pass through the membrane, and you must assume that when you introduce those particles into a patient, they're going to simply diffuse until equilibrium is achieved. They're going to diffuse across the membrane and equalize concentration. And it's even more complicated than that. By the way, we call that equilibrium. And you should anticipate or estimate tonicity at equilibrium. So when I say equilibrium, what do I mean by that? What do I mean you should estimate or anticipate tonicity at equilibrium? I mean that any particles that are in the solution, and it's going to take a little time, for them to diffuse, but they then diffused and equalized their concentration across the membrane. When that's said, when that process is finished, then we say that the solutions are in equilibrium. Once you, and this is a bit of scholasticism, but you should sort of commit to memory right now, if it's not evident to you, that it is the relative distribution or the relative concentration of non-penetrating particles that determines tonicity. The relative distribution of non-penetrating particles. Because the penetrating particles are simply going to diffuse and equalize. And that was the case over here, because we had more non-penetrating particles on the inside of the cell that caused the cell to increase in volume. Yes?
You mentioned estimated tonicity equilibrium, and how do we know you're at equilibrium?
You do.
You're giving a patient IVs,
Yeah.
and you know what.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And so this, I'm just trying to suggest basic principles of basic science, but you're right. Now, when you give a patient an IV, and on that IV bag it says X number of osmoles, that's fairly simple. All that is just counting the number of particles in there. But whether that IV or hydration therapy is isotonic, hypotonic, or hypertonic, that's just established over the years by empirical observation. And so if you have, well, we'll look at some examples in just a moment. But the simple answer to your question is, when I talk about equilibrium, I'm talking about a physical process, but as a matter of clinical reality, it's empirical. We just know that some solutions have an effect. For example, glucose. When you give a patient a glucose solution, what's going to happen to most of that glucose over time? Do your cells have anything to do with the glucose in your blood? Yeah, they're going to suck it up, usually, right? Or it's going to be metabolized into fat or something like that, through a variety of metabolic pathways. The point being that, yeah, this is only an approximation. An equilibrium is something of a physical, what's the word I'm looking for, ideal. It's just tended to imply that it takes a while for these things to balance out, and that's what we're referring to. Yes, sir.
So in A through D, the solution remains isoosmotic and hypotonic?
No, I wouldn't approach it that way. Your only concern as a clinician is the initial condition. We wouldn't, I don't know that you're getting, that's a little bit metaphysical. Because again, that's going to change dramatically over time. When are you going to make that determination? 15 minutes later, a day later, a year later? So this is really what's important for osmolality, the initial condition. Because again, that's just a concentration, a number on the back. There are a number of rules here. I think these you may want to reflect upon, but they're fairly self-evident once you've reflected upon the principles that we've discussed. You can assume that all intracellular solutes are non-penetrating. Why? Because we indicated a moment ago that if they're not, they would have already diffused out of the membrane. And then you'd be left with a cell in which all the solutes are non-penetrating. So anyway you cut it, that's generally going to be the case. And then again, this notion of equilibrium. Compare osmosis beforehand, that's what we were just talking about, and then tonicity is afterward, describes the volume change of the cell at equilibrium. So that's fairly common sense as well. We've indicated that it's really the ratio of non-penetrating particles that determines which way the water is going to go. And then this is just a good one to remember. A solution that is hypoosmotic will always be hypotonic. That's a good rule. But remember, an isotonic solution can be hyperosmotic or isoosmotic. Right? Now, as it turns out, I think most of the recent clinical literature would bear this out. I guess what I'm saying is, please don't leave this course and say that in the physiology class you learned that you should be giving your patients hypertonic therapies. No. In most cases, I think what the recent primary literature has shown isotonic is recommended for just about everything because it's safer, there are fewer complications. But I do want you to think about some of these points I made here. Again, this is sort of older or less modern clinical thinking. Hypertonic IV, in the total particle concentration is lower than the ICF. Again, we're talking about the intracellular fluid because if somebody take me through the sequence of events. I'm going to give a patient a bottle of a very high concentration of magnesium citrate. Somebody take me through what the sequence of events would be. It's going into the mouth, going into the esophagus, all right, so as it goes through the GI tract, what's going to happen to this very high total particle concentrated solution? What's going to happen? Yeah. All right, so let's be careful here. So high total particle concentration, when you give me a sense of direction, which way is the water going? All right, so where's the water coming from?
The cells.
Cells.
The cells. All right, so make sure you understand. So that hyperosmotic solution is all we know in this case, is the concentration. It's going to pull water out of the cells. Now, that's going to increase the concentration in the ECF. That may or may not be a problem. For you, that's going to be an issue when you're talking about blood vessel pressure, because you're going to find that if you start deviating from isotonic solutions, you have to think about vascular collapse or vascular distension, and that can be an issue. But usually, if everything's isotonic, it's not much of a problem. So that's exactly right. And that's why when we talk about these changes with respect to the ICF, with tonicity, we're more concerned about the ICF because that's where everything ends up. Water is either going into the cell or out of the cell for reasons of relative particle concentration. So hypertonic IV is going to cause the fluid to flow into the cells. It can cause severe dehydration. I have a link there. We won't worry about that. That's especially true. You have to be careful, especially with children, for a variety of reasons, especially as it relates to the cerebrospinal fluid. And I'm not going to ask you to memorize any concentrations. And then hypertonic IV, I think I had
Sorry, the hypotonic IV is maybe used in severe dehydration? Is it used in, or
it's not. No, so if a patient, you have a patient who has been out in the desert, comes in and just loss of total body water, and you want to rehydrate them. By rehydration, really, where do you want to put the water into that patient? Where does that water need to end up? The cells. So that's the idea there. Hopefully, if they're dehydrated, that means the particle concentration inside the cells now is even higher than normal. Right? And so if you give them a hypotonic solution, I'm not suggesting you do this. Please don't leave this course and say that I said to do this. If you give the patient a hypotonic solution, then the water is going to rush into the cells and hopefully rehydrate them. Trouble is, as I indicated, when you do that, it often causes cerebral edema. That's not good. As one who lives with that on a daily basis, that's not a good idea. So hypertonic IV, total particle concentration greater than the ICF. You can see, we talked about physiological osmolality. What was physiological osmolality according to that previous slide? 280 to 296, we rounded off to 300. So there's a lot of clinical leeway, and in your various textbooks, you'll see different numbers. I just want you to know that it becomes a real concern when the number is substantially higher than 300. And again, it depends on a variety of circumstances that you'll learn about later. But we can define hypertonic as being greater than 300, or again, clinically, usually greater than 350 is the more typical number. And so, in this case, it's going to reduce the volume of cells, and it might be used, for example, in a patient who has hyponatremia. So let's break that word down. Hypo means what? Lower or less than normal. Emia, in the ECF. So we have something that's lower in the blood. What is lower in the blood?
Sodium.
Yeah. So this would be, you often see the cases of this in marathon runners or bicyclists. And what are they doing as they're running or bicycling for a long marathon? They might be drinking pure water. And so what's going to be effective? drinking pure water when you're losing lots of electrolytes and everything else. Yeah, dilution. Yeah. Comprehensive systemic dilution. So a hypertonic IV means you, as a compensatory mechanism, you're going to introduce into that patient an abnormally high concentration of perhaps electrolytes, ions, solutes, as a compensatory measure. Again, the trouble is there can be a number of side effects that you may not be able to anticipate. So you don't have to memorize concentrations here. And on the record, those of you recording this, please do not administer hypotonic IVs to your patients. I'm only recommending isotonic. We're just approaching this from a theoretical perspective. And then if they tell you otherwise, this would be an example of a hypertonic. Well, that's an injection rather than an IV. Yes.
So a hypertonic solution would be penetrating the cells, right?
Hypertonic solution, yes. That's, again, if the patient is already overhydrated, they have a high water to electrolyte concentration.
So it's just a base electrolyte concentration.
Yeah, again, in theory, yes. Again, I'm not suggesting or recommending that therapy. Obviously, you can see that I had a problem with this one time before. I'm trying to avert that problem. All right, any questions about osmolality and chemistry? Okay, so we're going to change focus a little bit here. We need to go back and build upon our previous discussion of membrane voltage, membrane potential, and see how that relates to intercellular signaling, especially intercellular signaling among cells of the nervous system, because that's going to be our first major systems discussion, the nervous system. And to that end, let's use the analogy that several years ago a student made incessant mockery of me about always standing at the door, using the door as a channel analogy. But then remember, the room is the cell here. And we're going to have a channel here of some type. And so we just think of the door as being a membrane transporter or a channel. Channel more appropriate in this context. Now, we know that there's going to be an imbalance of ion concentration across the membrane. You already know there's a higher concentration of sodium ions outside the cell and a higher concentration of potassium ions inside the cell. We've talked about the importance of the sodium-potassium pump and so on for the maintenance and the sustenance of that ion concentration difference. Now, remember, if there's a difference in the concentration of ions across the membrane, let's just say we pointed out that the membrane potential, which we defined as a voltage, is generally, let's pick a number out of the air. Let's just say it's negative 75 millivolts. Negative 75 millivolts. Why did we say the membrane potential is negative? Because the interior of the cell is negative with respect to the exterior. And that's because there is a preponderance of cations outside the cell. Virtually all cations, except for potassium, are more abundant outside the cell. And there's a preponderance of a few anions, especially of protein anions inside the cell, unless you get this imbalance. And that is called the diffusion potential. The diffusion potential is the membrane voltage that is exclusively attributable to the imbalance or difference in charges across the membrane. Okay. All right, so this is going to be my channel again. And remember we talked about 3 ways that the channels can be opened. And we said that under normal circumstances, channels are closed with one exception. What was the exception? The leak channel. So I'm going to create a leak channel here. So this is a potassium leak channel. Somebody tell me which way the potassium ions are going to flow through the leak channel, in or out? Out. All right, so potassium leak channel is going to allow potassium ions to flow out. And is that going to have any effect on membrane potential? Yes. All right. Potassium ions are positive or negative? Positive. All right, so they're going to leak out. is that going to cause the membrane potential to go, I was ready to say go up or down? Is it become more positive or more negative?
More positive.
More negative. More positive.
All right, so we have, let's fight it out. All right, so let's think of that. I'm a potassium ion. I've been called worse. I'm positively charged, and I'm going to leak out. I've been inclined to leak out on multiple occasions in there. So I'm leaking out. I'm carrying my positivity with me. The cell gets more negative. So that means we're going from negative 75 to maybe negative 80 or negative 85 or whatever. Is that clear? So as a result, and here's what I want you to be sure you understand, as a result of the potassium leak channel, the interior of the cell becomes more negative in there, so we have a more negative membrane potential. Let's say we talk about sodium ions. There are sodium leak channels. They're not very important in those cells, so we won't worry about them. But let's say we have a sodium leak channel. We just have a sodium channel here. The sodium channel opens. Which way is the sodium going to move? In or out? In. Sodium ions are going to move in. Will the sodium ion current have any effect on membrane potential? Yes. How will it affect the membrane potential? All right, less negative or more positive. We're increasing the number of positive charges inside the cell, and therefore we are reducing the difference in charge across the cell, and that's very important because we have a word to describe that. All right. But before we get into that, I've got another question. So, switching sides, I'm going to become a positively charged sodium ion, and I'm moving into the cell. And I want you to tell me at what point I'm going to stop moving into the cell. I've got all my friends out here, they're all sodium ions, and we're going to move in, we've got a sodium current, we've got a good thing going here. What's going to stop me from moving into the cell? When do I stop coming?
Close equilibrium of charge.
I'm sorry?
When you reach an equilibrium of charge.
What does that mean? I don't know what that means.
Well, there's no, if it's negative inside, more negative, then the positive ions want to flow into that. But when there's, I guess when you reach a zero membrane potential and there's no more flow.
Oh, you're exactly right. But I want to make sure that you're exactly right. I want to make sure everybody understands what you're saying. Are you saying, George, that the sodium ions will keep moving into the cell until the number of sodium ions is equal on the inside and outside?
No.
No. So you're exactly right. So make sure you understand that the sodium current stops before the sodium ion concentration is equal on both sides of the membrane. And what would cause it to stop? George is exactly right. The sodium ions are going to move into the cell, and as they do so, they're rendering the cell more positive. What do we know about electrostatics? What happens to when two positive charges come together? They repel. So as the interior of the room becomes more positive, and I'm a positively charged sodium, getting more positive in here, I'm being repelled, I'm being pushed back. So there are two primary factors that determine the flux of ions across the membrane. Number one is concentration. That's described by diffusion potential. And as George points out, the other one is the charge gradient, the electrostatic charge gradient, such that the positively charged sodium ions, as they try to work their way into the cell, are repelled by the increasingly positive environment of the cell interior. And when we combine both of those, both the concentration gradient and the charge gradient, and we use those to determine the balance of ions across the membrane, that's called the equilibrium potential. We also call the electrochemical potential, or the electrochemical gradient. Diffusion refers just to concentration. Equilibrium, at least in our somewhat simplified definition, refers to both charge and concentration. And so we've already talked about potassium. I've already asked that question. These next two slides just refer to a discussion of what happens when we have potassium leak channels. But the last thing I would make here, we need to talk a little bit about the word depolarize and hyperpolarize. So in effect, we're saying that the cell is like a battery. It has a positive charge on the outside and a negative charge on the inside. And that when we open the sodium channel, is the difference in charge increasing or decreasing? Increasing or decreasing? Is the difference decreasing? So in effect, I'm killing the battery. Right? If the cell is a battery, it's reducing its voltage. And so the term to describe the evening, the leveling of the charge difference across the membrane is called depolarization. Depolarization. Where there once was a polarity, it's being reduced. So the sodium current is generally depolarizing. What about the potassium current? Is it depolarizing? Hyperpolarizing? Has no effect? What is it? Hyperpolarizing. Hyper means increasing. We're increasing the charge difference. Everybody see why? Because we're making the interior of the cell more negative, and therefore it's already positive out there because of those sodium ions. So we're intensifying that difference. So in effect, depolarization is moving the membrane potential towards zero. It's killing the battery. And the irony there, if indeed that's the proper word, is that that's when all the excitement occurs. Unlike a battery that provides energy for the microphone and so many other things, your cell phones and so on, the cell does things when it's depolarized. Kind of counterintuitive. Just want to make sure you know those terms. All right, so we've talked about equilibrium potential. We've talked about diffusion potential. There's another one, resting membrane potential. Resting membrane potential really just refers to equilibrium potential with a few other factors that we'll talk about later. But it's just let's just say an excitable cell at rest. Does anybody remember what the excitable tissues were? We mentioned this before.
Muscles.
Yeah, the nervous, cardiac, muscle, all those would be excitable because they have the ability to undergo rapid changes in membrane potential. That's really what makes them excitable. So when we talk about a resting membrane potential, we're talking about a cell that has the ability to do something dynamic with its membrane potential, but at the moment it's at rest. And normally that resting potential is equilibrium potential. So the nearest potential is a membrane potential that can be calculated, curiously enough, by what is called the Nernst equation. And there are several examples of the Nernst equation up here. Disappointingly for you, I'm not going to ask that you memorize the Nernst equation.
Very disappointing.
But I do want you to pay attention to its significance. What is it solving for? So over here, what's on the left side of the equation? What are we solving for by the Nernst equation? Anybody have any speculations on V or E? Voltage, yeah. The E stands, it's a German from electromotive, it's just another word for voltage. And the VEQ, what's the EQ? Equilibrium potential or voltage. And as you can see in that second, the lower equation there, really all we need to know, because the entire equation consists of an array of constants. Remember your ideal gas law, how much you enjoyed that in chemistry and so on. Just a variety of constants, but what is most important in solving for equilibrium potential or the Nernst potential is this right here. What does that mean? Can you see that? What's that? What do I need to know to calculate the Nernst potential?
The
relative ion concentration. We're only talking about one ion now. We're only talking about potassium or sodium or chloride. I can calculate the Nernst potential for a single ion if all I need to know is the concentration outside the cell and the concentration inside the cell. And then I just plug the values into those constants are going to be steady state for our purposes. We don't have to worry about those changing. And so, for example, what I've done here, and you can do this with your cell phone or calculator or whatever, this is EK. So E again is electromotive voltage, and K, what is that? Potassium. And so I'm plugging these numbers in right here. And as a consequence, you can do that. I should get a voltage that's somewhere where, what should be my nurse potential? Something close to that. Yeah.
Voltage pretty much in German.
Oh, it just means the voltage that's attributable to the ion concentration difference. Yeah. Because that's really all you need to know to calculate the nurse potentials. The nurse potential is a relatively simple thing. But do we understand then how we calculate it? It's just basically derived from a series of constants and the difference in concentration. Now, you'll see different numbers in the textbook. That's not terribly important. This is more, these numbers are more appropriate for human cells, especially human neurons. And it gets a little more complicated than this, but we said that a typical, I guess this is as good a point as any to talk about this, and then we'll finish up. Most neuronal cells have membrane potentials around negative 75 or negative 70. Most muscle cells have membrane potentials usually around negative 85, negative 90, with a few exceptions. So in general, muscles have a more negative membrane potential than do neurons. So this would be typical of, it's kind of curious, this is more typical of a muscle cell than a neuron. So we might ask ourselves if on a test, I might ask you, what is the most important channel for resting membrane potential in neurons or glial cells or muscle cells? Which channel is most important for regulating or establishing resting membrane potential and why? Any thoughts? Voltage-gated channels, they're not doing anything. Ligand-gated channels, they're not doing anything.
Weak channels?
What would be a factor, most important channel for determining resting membrane potential we talked about? Well, the sodium potassium pump is very important, but it's not a channel. It's a pump. What channel would be most important?
Are you asking for an ion, like what specific ion channel? Or
Well, that's all we've got. All we've got to work with, ion channel. How about calcium? Well, the calcium is important in the process. You would be exactly right if there were a significant abundance of sodium channels. I would agree with you, but and certainly in neurons, there aren't very many. They're going to cause problems. It's the potassium lead channel. So make sure you understand the potassium lead channel is really the only one that comes into play. And what is its significance? It makes the membrane potential more negative or more positive. All right, that's all the time we have, so we'll resume this discussion. What, next week, I guess? Yeah, thank you. That's what I was going to mention.